Welcome to Bards and Barrels, the podcast for Dungeons & Dragons players new and old. I'm Ross Druce, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts Brett Miller and Phil Boone. We'll be exploring the world of Dungeons & Dragons in each episode, sharing our experiences, offering tips and advice for those who play and run this classic game. So whether you're a new player just starting out or a seasoned veteran looking to get a new perspective on things, Bards and Barrels has something for everyone. So sit back, grab a drink, and join us as we roll for initiative and embark on an epic adventure. And there's the opening crack.
Redemption.
That was a good one. That was a very good one.
That one's acceptable.
Nice, strong.
Oh, please.
Swift on the pole. I love it.
Worked really hard on that one, guys. Come on.
Really.
We could see the focus.
He's like staring at his beard. All right, it's time for another episode of Bards and Barrels. I'm Ross, along with me for the ride tonight, Phil and Brett. How we doing, guys?
Good. I'm ready for this one.
So we have a little bit of a confession to make. In the last DMing episode, we did say that it was the last one, and then we realized that we totally said we were going to talk about game mechanics and how to actually run the game, and didn't do that. So tonight is, like Phil said, it's the redemption episode. We are actually going to tell you how to run the game.
At least makeup episode.
Yeah, makeup. That's exactly right. So let's get started with a little bit of like, what are the three core concepts, the pillars of D&D, fellas?
Yeah, so if you have read, I think it's in probably the Player's Handbook and the DM's Guide, really even in the basic rules, I think covers it, but D&D's kind of built on three pillars, right? So you have exploration, what is out there. There's kind of this social interaction aspect of meeting people, talking through different situations, and then lastly, and kind of what most people think about when they think D&D, is the combat side of it as well.
And so kind of what we want to do for this episode is we're going to go through all three of those and tell you how certain things apply to this. So as you're running a game, you're going to run into challenge ratings, which essentially give you the how hard is this going to be for your party, and you can choose to scale that based on the level of your party. So it's like, level 1 parties, your challenge rating is going to be lower, so they're going to be able to roll lower and still complete things, right? Whereas if you have a party that's 13th to 15th level, they're going to have to roll higher to complete those same kind of things. So as we go through the three pillars, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how you can use inspiration, which is, which one of you guys wants to talk about inspiration? Brett?
It's like, if you do something really cool, you can give it to your player. If your players do something really cool, you can give them inspiration, and they can use that at their leisure.
Mm-hmm. So you're right, Brett. What you would do is you would burn your inspiration to gain advantage on a skill check, an attack roll, or a
saving throw.
Saving throw. Thank you. Yes. So that's the third one. So your DM can grant that to you at any time based on something cool you did, or if you are an avid follower of Dungeons and Daddies, if you tell a good dad joke, they grant inspiration for that. So it could be for really anything. And then speaking of, if you get advantage, what is advantage? What is disadvantage? So we'll talk about a little bit of about that and where that may come into play in each of these pillars. So let's start with exploration, guys. So this is a very redundant question in a lot of ways, but how does exploration work in D&D? Like, where do you see this?
In a world. You're building the world, so you are dropping your players in somewhere, and they have to figure out what's going on, where they need to go to complete whatever mission they're on. And so that might be going through a dungeon. That might be crossing through a forest or a different land.
Or even crossing planes, too, right? It just kind of depends on what your adventure does and where you're headed, but one of the most challenging parts, I think, on the DM side for exploration is figuring out the best way to do something like travel, personally. That's something that I always kind of find challenging, and I've tried to find, different ways that other people have done it and, hone in on some of that. Like, I think in one of our campaigns, we had several days worth of travel, and you had opportunities to, like, level up skills or practice a skill set or something like that, to potentially gain either proficiency or increase an ability score, something you can kind of gain out of that. But I think the whole other side of exploration, especially travel, is random encounters.
Absolutely. So, like, as you're traveling, so to back up just for a second, so I think it's hard, or I find it extremely hard. Like, time in D&D it's weird because it's like this entire thing that you did today may take place over 3 days, but you just crammed it into 4 hours in your session, right? So it's like in your brain, is it 4 hours or is it an entire day? Because there's a lot of things you skipped the minutia of the day, right? And so it's like if time's complicated, then distance, at least for me, is also complicated. Like you look at a map of Faerun, the scale on that map, it's like an inch is like 200 miles.
Yeah.
So like the distance between Baldur's Gate and El Terrell, it would take you going by wagon, maybe not horse, but if you're walking or going by wagon, yeah, it's probably going to take you a day and a half to get there. But it's like in your game, you're like, okay, you took off toward El Terrell. Okay, you're there. It's like, where did that time go? Like they're figuring out a way to grasp the concept around time and distance in the game is so hard to do.
And you're not trying to play Oregon Trail. Like your whole game isn't around the travel. So it's okay to speed through some of that stuff. Like
Sure.
riding in a wagon is not probably going to be very exciting. If your wagon gets jumped by a pack of dire wolves, that might be some exciting, especially for certain levels of character.
And I think you just hit the nail on the head. So that brings you back to random encounters. So it's like if you're traveling a long distance, odds are something is going to happen over the course of that distance. So the game, I think it's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, that gives you tables that you can roll on. So you would roll a D100. Sometimes you could roll a D20. It tells you which dice to roll, and then you roll it, and then based on your roll, it gives you this happens. So maybe you just come across some people that you can interact with, or maybe you come across a pack of direwolves that attacks you upon seeing you, or something like that.
One of the games, and going into video games for a minute here, that does this really well is like Red Dead Redemption. And a lot of games do this, is where if you're traveling from place A to place B, and sometimes you'll have a random person start shouting at you from the side of the road. Sometimes it's a friendly like side quest that you can do, but sometimes it's somebody attacking you. And so it's not always good, and it's not always bad. You can kind of make it into whatever you want it to be as the DM.
Yeah, I think a big part of that too comes to, on the DM side, comes to knowing your party. Like understand not just your player characters, but the people sitting at your table too. How important is the exploration pillar to them? Like, is it a big deal to some of those people that they like the wagon ride? If you have a player that likes the wagon ride, don't skim over that part too much, and you're gonna have to build not maybe even random encounters. You might have to just fully build some encounters that are gonna happen, just to make sure that you're hitting on that pillar.
And I think this may sound intimidating to people, but I think you'll get a feel from your party. It's like you'll know when not to skip that ride if your players are having conversations about things. Like they're having this very constructive conversation about themselves, about what they need to do when they reach their destination. You can just say, hey, 15 minutes has passed, or an hour has passed, or 20 miles has passed, but you just let them keep going. You don't have to like actively intervene.
I think you bring up a great point there, Ross, because what I also think that travel really leads itself well into, or leans into, is a whole nother aspect of storytelling. Like it gives you this opportunity to, if you need to introduce some side story through a random NPC that approaches the party, you can. Or maybe they, as they're traveling, stop at a tavern and they hear whisperings about what's going on in an area. It gives you a whole nother opportunity to interject some of that.
It also gives you as the DM an opportunity to get in your player's head a little bit of what they're planning to do, because they're probably going to be sitting in front of you discussing their plans, and then you can adjust how you're going to do things in a few minutes based on what they're presenting to you.
Absolutely. And at least in my experience from running like pre-written campaigns, I don't feel like there's ever been a shortage of things to throw in those instances. There's typically, like you mentioned, Phil, there's some little side quests that play a part in the bigger story that you can throw in along there, or there's always NPCs that I never feel like I get to, or never like fully flesh out for whatever reason, that you could, maybe that's who they run into, which then leads them to the side quest before they ever get to where they're going. So I think there's lots of things that you can possibly do. Another thing to talk about is resting. So generally what we've kind of discussed and looked up in the Wizards books is that 2 short rests plus a long rest is a day, right? That's going to advance you through a day. Do you guys play that way? Is that typically what you see in your sessions? Is this what other people are going to see in their sessions?
I think 2's fairly realistic. I mean, a short rest is equivalent to an hour of just taking a little break, catching your breath, and it gives you an opportunity to get spell slots back or health back, like get some of your things back, but not everything. And then a long rest is a full 8 hours of taking a nap or like going to sleep for the night.
I think I probably, as a DM, do a bad job about letting people take short rests, and then maybe let people take too many long rests. I don't know. You know who's. I'm gonna throw our buddy Matt under the bus because we could really use a long rest right now in our
Please.
campaign, and we are dying. And we have been in
Badly.
a lot of encounters back to back. But
Yes.
honestly, with what we're reading, I actually think it's in line with probably what an adventuring day would be. So
And limiting how many long rests you give your players helps balance out the different class features.
Mhm.
Like your long rest is going to reset those key class features that you only get once per long rest.
Right.
I definitely think that not getting regular rest makes combat more challenging and more realistic. Like
Mhm.
the threat is more real.
Right. But I think we all fall into the trope of you just had a deadly encounter. Everybody wants a long rest. Okay, sure, take your long rest. But then you walk right into another deadly encounter. And then if it's, if it doesn't go right and people get hurt, then they want another long rest right away, which really isn't the way you should do that.
Right.
It's like it should probably be, you just took a long rest. Sorry, you can take a short rest if you want. Or you just took 2 short rests and your long rest is gone. Sorry, you don't get any more. I don't know a situation where I would tell a party, no rest at all. But in theory, you could if the time.
But sometimes you run into situations where your rest gets interrupted.
True. That's
Mhm.
what I
True.
would do. I would let them take a rest, but there's a high probability that something might happen while they're resting.
Going back to random encounter tables,
Yeah.
or
Or
just baddies around, and it's like in Minecraft. Yeah, the monsters are close. You can't sleep right now.
Yes.
Exactly.
We're touching all the video games today.
Yeah, why not? Just bounce around. It's all good. Any other thoughts before we move on? Because we got a lot of stuff to cram into this episode. Any other thoughts on exploration?
I would say don't underestimate how important it is just to maintain a balance. It's kind of the pillar that gets forgotten most, in my opinion at least.
I agree.
But it helps you put your players into that world.
I think too, especially if you're running like a homebrew campaign, the exploration becomes so much more about telling the people about your world. So don't skip over that. Especially if you spend time building that.
I think you make an excellent point in homebrews because, like, you could throw something in that nobody's ever seen before. So if you have an experienced party, they're used to going around Faerun and they generally know where things are going to be. But now all of a sudden, they've never been in this town that you made up that now exists on the map. So I have to go exploring to find out what's here. I got to talk to people to find out what's here. And I think that's a unique perspective for that. Not that a incoming DM is necessarily going to have that problem.
So if you're talking to people and introducing them to your world, that gets us into the next pillar, which is social encounters, social interaction. So it's meeting the people or characters or creatures in your world and learning things and engaging with them.
This is probably one that I personally struggle with the most, I think, for me. And it probably comes back to that Phil never plays a charisma-based character because that's just not who I am. But this is one that I really have to work at, for sure. Even introducing like long-standing NPCs, like it takes me some time to kind of get that integrated and figure out how that person fits. And I don't know, that's just something that I struggle with.
I think I'm the opposite of that. I think
agree.
I'm pretty decent at like a couple of like the if you ever run the Death House in Curse of Strahd, like the 2 little kids, the dead kids. It's like, sorry, spoiler alert.
Yeah, geez, wait, they're dead? No,
It's fine. It's all good. But I think that's a good example because it's like I feel like I find interesting ways to leverage them to like set the mood and draw people in. And it's just me talking. Like if I know the story well enough, then it's just like I'm using them to advance the story kind of thing. So I think I do that pretty well.
And those are key encounters, like key people, NPCs in your game. But there's also just like the random shopkeeper that you have to kind of haggle with your players on prices if they want to buy something. It's all sorts of being a person in your world and engaging with your players.
Now, I will say that one thing I always try to make sure to do is not force combat. So if you guys go up into an
Yeah.
interaction and you can talk yourselves out of it, by all means, like there's no need to have a combat if you have a witty way to get out of it. I absolutely think that that should stand. Like, don't, as a DM, get so locked into, well, they're supposed to have this huge battle. Okay, you know what? Save your big battle. Like, maybe it'll come up in the future. But if the players are smart enough to get out of that or get around that, or
More power to them.
yeah,
Well, but you also have to think about and read through whatever you're playing. If you're playing a published adventure, most of the time your NPC, they've got their own ideals, bonds, flaws, different personal characteristics that will lead them to a plausible outcome. Like somebody might be quick to the trigger that you're playing, that your players are meeting, or somebody might they're very lawful, neutral, and don't want to get involved.
parlay.
Yeah, exactly. So
I hate parlay.
get into your character or the NPC you're that playing a little bit and think, what would they do in this situation?
I will say, I know we talked in a previous episode a little bit about some of the material that we like, but if you've read through any of those, like the Monsters Know What They're Doing books, it talks about some of those motivations that your different monster types would have. And I found that to be super helpful as well. Just kind of knowing, oh, well, honestly, this monster doesn't have a high enough intelligence to know better. If it gets injured, it's going to run. Simple things like that. Or does it serve someone? That can help kind of build into those things as well. If they can intimidate a monster.
Or if you have a character that is they could go either way, depending on what your players do. If it's like if they have a good thing happen to the player and they pulls the NPC toward their side, that's a +1. But if they say something that's going to make the NPC mad, it's a -1. And once you get to 3 or 5 or something,
It triggers.
it triggers.
Yeah.
Like that person's going to attack or that person's going to help them out.
I actually really like that idea, Brett, to almost build like allies as you're
Yeah.
going through the game. In essence, like positive interactions, negative interactions.
Because in real life, you're not going to walk up to somebody and they're immediately going to be your ally.
Yeah.
You've got to kind of earn it a little bit. So don't be afraid to use that to try and make your players work for it a little bit.
Mental note on that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. I know.
But you guys make a good point. So when we're talking about persuading people, when we're talking about haggling with storekeepers, a key part of that is skill checks. And you would do skill checks in exploration, so don't necessarily think we're not including it there because you would never use it. It just fits better here. Let's talk about skill checks for a second. So on your player sheet, you're going to have a whole list of things that are related to your core statistics that you have. So you could do athletics checks, you could do deception, you could do persuasion. There's going to be a whole ton of them. So just take a look at your character sheet. We won't go through all of them. But at any given time as a DM, depending on the situation you're in, if you're talking with a barkeeper and you're trying to haggle your way out of something, you could ask them to roll persuasion. See how persuasive are they. Your persuasion will have a modifier. You roll the d20, and based on how you roll, the DM's going to decide whether you pass that or not. That also connects back to a challenge rating, because depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to not pay 5 more gold for something, as a DM, I'm probably not going to rate that as too high of a challenge rating, especially if you're pretty good at persuading people. But if you're trying to haggle, that really kick-ass sword that's on the wall behind him that has some sort of magical properties that has a pretty high price point on it, I'm going to make that roll a little higher, or that challenge rating a little higher, so make it harder for you to do.
You might also hear it called like difficulty class. So sometimes it's like DC or CR. A lot of DMs use them interchangeably, but CR sometimes you'll hear more so with like a stat block for a monster. DC you'll hear with like ability checks, saving throws, combat. We're going to use them interchangeably just so you guys know, but if you read something like that, just know that's what the DC stands for, difficulty class.
And it goes from 0 up to like 30.
Honestly, I forget that it goes that high.
So
Never use it that
like,
way.
in the Dungeon Master's Guide, it goes, and most of the books have this really. It goes from like very easy, a challenge rating of 5, all the way up to moderate at 15, hard at 20, and then up from there.
As a DM too, one of the things I appreciate that is in the book is it says if it's something that is so easy that you don't think the characters even need to try, don't even make them roll for it. Like, just let them succeed.
opening a door, like
Unlocked door. No,
picking up something off of the ground. You know,
right.
silly.
Roll athletics. It's heavy.
Sure, if it's heavy,
It's an
yeah.
iron door.
So something else to talk about here. So we've talked about NPCs, but we generally have focused on like a little bit more major NPCs. Everybody's gonna go talk to the barkeeper, right? And there's always gonna be characters that books give you or that you're gonna make up that are crucial to advancing your story. How would you guys handle like your party's walking through the streets and they're like, "Is there anybody around us?" And you're like, "Yeah, there's other people milling about," and then they just go pick a random person to talk to. How would you handle that in your game?
Woo, buckle up.
Honestly, I hate it, but I try to figure it out. I mean, it's not hard to have random tables ready, right? So if you have an inkling because you know your party that they're gonna do something like that, maybe just have like a couple stock NPCs handy of because they're gonna want to know like, okay, what's the sex of this character? What race and class are they? So at least having that base idea and a name or a hat full of names or a Discord channel full of names or whatever it is, right? Like
Perfect.
something, and then from there you just kind of roll with it.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're going to talk to people that don't know anything,
True.
Right.
and you can stiff the players on information, and that's okay too.
You make an excellent point. So typically in the pre-built adventures that I've seen, almost always when they talk about a town, they will tell you, the book will tell you, people in this town know this general information. Like if something's wrong in this town, like the mayor hasn't been seen for 6 weeks because he would give a speech every Friday and all of a sudden he hasn't been doing it for a month and a half, they will know that.
Yep.
DM does not have to give that information willingly. To your point, you can stiff them and tell them nothing. This could just be Joe Blow and he doesn't know jack. He doesn't want to be involved in this, right? He could tell them nothing. But they do know something, and the book will almost always tell you that.
I feel like I'm going to start flipping a coin of whether it's someone who is friendly or like a pickpocket or you know what I mean? Like it doesn't.
We need to
have
stop
be.
this podcast, Ross, because this is going to
Yeah,
come
I'm
back
giving
and
Phil
fight us.
too many ideas. No, I love this though, but I think that's great too because it's like how often in that situation are you like, oh, this is just peasant person on the street.
Mm-hmm.
You may have picked the wrong person who's gonna steal everything you have.
Member of the Thieves Guild. Like
Yeah.
there are a lot of opportunities.
Maybe it's another adventuring party that you don't know about. So it's another rogue that lifted your money or a sorcerer that put a curse on you, but you didn't know it because they did it silently over in the corner watching you. I don't know. Just some interesting things. Okay, so now
Before we
I
get
don't like
some more
that.
ideas.
Well, we're moving on to combat. We're just
Oh,
going to get in
no.
more and more. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the one that everybody's probably been waiting for, and it really is probably the biggest of the three, or maybe not the biggest, but it's probably the most complex of the three. Let's talk about combat. And I think we start at the top. So when a combat situation starts because you've triggered it because you pissed off the bartender or you're fighting the big bad baddie, what's the first thing that's going to happen?
Roll initiative.
And how do you do that?
Everyone rolls a d20 and adds their initiative modifier to it. It's also typically your dexterity modifier if you can't find your initiative modifier on your sheet. And then the DM is going to write down the order, basically. So as a DM, you're also responsible for rolling for whatever monsters are a part of that or whatever the opposite side, NPCs, whatever it is. And those will get added into your order. The party doesn't need to know that up front. They do not need to know when your NPCs or monsters are taking their turns, but that is how combat will run. So you'll start with the highest scores at the top, work your way down, all the way down to 1, and then you'll have the next round of combat.
And I think that is the part that, at least initially, of course, separates this from the other two entirely. Because everything up to this point could feel very chaotic, and it's very bang, 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 depending on how your players are reacting to things. Immediately when you go into combat, structure.
Yep.
It's like you're going to do things in a turn-based order.
And if you, as a DM, if you know the players are going to get into combat, one thing I would really recommend is pre-rolling your initiative for the monsters. So you don't have to do it at the table. Just have them already written down and an initiative number next to their name. So you're not trying to layer that in while trying to take in everybody else's numbers. You can already have the monsters already figured out.
That's super helpful. I don't know why I haven't done that before.
That it's one of the things that has like I have struggled to figure out. Like, oh, I can't keep track of all these initiative
Yeah.
order in the heat of the moment. So just doing that ahead of time makes it so much easier.
Brett brings up a great point because this is what happens when you say everyone roll initiative. People just start yelling numbers at you.
Yes.
Yes.
So
Oh my god.
you have to be really fast of like, and I usually do at least have people's names pre-written down so I can just like quickly write the numbers. Then I have to resort my list.
Yep.
But man, there are tools, right? I mean, roll
Yeah.
20.
Yes.
This is
Beyond,
where,
yeah.
like, if you're playing online, it's
Tabletop.
really easy. But
Yeah.
there's also a whole world of initiative trackers that you can have on your table
Mhm.
and display to your players, and like they can write in the number or and then like move pieces around. It's a whole world if you look into anything on Instagram or Pinterest or anything.
In case it comes up, rolling initiative ties between your players are differentiated based on their dexterity modifier. So if one person has a +3, one person has a +2, the +3 wins. If they're still tied, make them roll again. Highest number goes before the other person.
Okay, so the next thing that I had on my list was to talk about attack rolls, but I think there's something very important that we need to talk about before that. So, keeping in mind that we're doing this from the perspective of a first-time DM, when that first person goes, let's assume for a second it's a player, it's not a monster or something like that. This is where the game, if you're not already overwhelmed, can become a little more overwhelming because especially if you're playing with new players, they're going to look to you to be like, well, I'm going to do this, but what's that do? How do you handle that? Because I feel like at least at the beginning, before you go really quick, I do feel like at least at the beginning, it's like you are helping them learn their characters, and if you're a first time DM and they're first time players, you're doing a lot of you just got to learn on the fly.
This is where it's really handy to have access to their player sheet, whether it's a copy of their sheet or like an online version of it. It's a lot easier to be able to look at it without having to go around the table and look over their shoulder.
I agree with Brett 100%. Even when we all play online, I have all of your character sheets up in separate tabs, so that way I can like look through actions and figure out if you do have a question, like what an action does, or if you're getting ready to cast a spell, what does that spell do? Just so you can push some of that to your players. New players are hard. I completely agree, but especially as you start playing with a group and they get more comfortable, you can ask them, okay, remind me, what does that do? And
Right.
they can look it up. So it's not all on you.
Right.
But for a new party, hopefully you're low level. So you're not talking about, a ton of features yet. But a lot of that will fall to you kind of as a DM. And I do think Brett's right. That's the easiest way, is to have a copy of their character sheet. And if there's one thing that you need to remember, write it down. If you're like, okay, now how does sneak attack work again? Write that down.
Right. And I think it's going to be far more complicated with players that are spellcasters because they're going to say, well, I'm going to cast Fireball. And then if you've never seen Fireball cast before, you're going to be like, okay, what does that do? And don't be afraid to say, just read to me what it does.
Yep.
Because it's like, then everybody can be like, oh, that's how you do this, or that's how I think this works, right? And then just keep going. It's fine.
There are so many spells, it's okay to not know all of them.
Oh, for sure.
There's
absolutely.
just so many.
And believe me, as you go, you do learn a lot of those. Like, I'm surprised how many I know now. Like, you just say it, and I'm like, oh, I know what that does, or something like that. But also, there's going to be several players at the table who they're just going to fire their bow or they're going to swing their sword. So,
Right.
so other than maybe pointing out, this is what you're rolling to attack, this is what you're rolling for damage, it probably isn't going to be too complex, but just know that there's going to be questions asked. Not everybody's going to know what's going on.
Now, I will say, as a new DM for a young party, especially, you can remind them about bonus actions, like what they can do.
Well, I would even take it beyond that and say you don't have to attack.
Right.
You
Mhm.
can also do a whole slew of other things. You can dash, disengage, hide, ready in action. All those things are possible as well,
Yeah, because
which can be overwhelming to explain to them. But it's like attacking isn't always necessarily the first thing you have to do.
So after your players are going, the next natural thing that's going to happen is they're going to attack, and they're going to attack the baddie. They're going to attack an NPC or something. So how, guys, do they do that?
They pull out their sword and slice.
AKA, you pull out a d20.
At
At least
Yes.
for any type of an attack roll, you're going to roll a d20, and then your sheet is going to tell you what sort of a modifier you're going to have. Depending on the weapon type and your character build, a lot of times it's going to be your strength modifier plus your proficiency bonus if you're proficient with that weapon, and if you're a strength-based character, it's a strength-based weapon. Other times it may be dex. That's getting into the weeds. But you're going to roll dice, you're going to add modifier. If what you rolled is higher than the player, the opposite side of this, the monster, the NPC, whatever it is, higher than their armor class, that's going to be a hit. If you hit, you get a roll damage. And then that's the other number that's after your to hit bonus. It'll tell you 1d6 plus 2, whatever that number is, the number of dice you're going to roll, plus some sort of a modifier, usually your strength modifier there as well. That'll be the damage that you do. And then if it's a type, bludgeoning, piercing, necrotic, I mean, if you're casting spells.
So this is the time you get to use all those other dice in your bag.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Truly. Yeah.
This is why you need the full set.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Almost everything else can just use the D20, but this is where you get the fun one.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to visualize this is it's a 1 versus 1 comparison. So it's your attack roll with your modifier against an armor class. So if you need a different way to like visualize that, it's the shield of the character. If you surpass the shield with your attack, you're gonna hit and cause damage, right? So that's how that would work. You roll the dice for the damage, HP goes down, hit points, health points, however you want to call that. I've heard it both ways.
Book says hit points, but a lot of people say health
points.
I know.
That's video game.
It is
verbiage right there. And then from there, once the hit points reach 0, that's some stuff for a different day that we should probably talk about.
Death saves. Stay tuned.
Yeah, death. Yes. Where's Anthony? I'm still wondering if he completed his death saves on that. So something else we need to talk about too. So if a player can cast a spell, or sometimes weapons cause this, depending on area of effect and things like that. Again, a little bit into the weeds there. Monsters can do it, players can do it. But when certain things are cast, they may call for a saving throw on the part of the opposition or anybody that's within range of the person doing this attack. Guys, what is a saving throw and how does it work?
So for some spells, it's just going to say it must beat a certain number.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of them, if you are a spellcaster, you'll have a spellcasting save, and it's based on whatever your core skill is that you're casting spells with. You're going to do 10 plus whatever that number is. If you're using any sort of an online tool, that number is already there for you. You don't have to do the math, anything like that. We also see saving throws pop up outside of the spell world as well. Maybe you are going up a mountain path and a rock is falling, and you have to make a dexterity saving throw to see if you are quick enough to dodge out of the way for that rock. Those instances where you're trying to avoid damage, something is happening to you and you're trying to get out of it, that's an instance where you're going to hit a saving throw. You roll your d20. There is a separate section on your character sheet for saving throws. You will add whatever the modifier is for that particular type. Dex, strength, charisma, constitution, whatever they are. I don't even know if they're all up there, actually, now that I think about it. But
I think they're
are they all up there?
Yeah, I think
so. Yeah.
So I think one other aspect of saving throws, we put that in the combat area because typically it's associated with weapon attacks, depending on the weapon, spells, things like that. Another place saving throws could come up. If your party walks into a room where maybe there's some explosive gas or something milling through, you could have your party roll for perception. If they fail their perception, everybody's going to be making a dexterity save or perhaps a constitution save when the room blows up because they walked into some flammable gas with a lit torch. Anybody Ari in this room know about that?
It happens.
He's not as defensive as he used to be. I think he's just given up.
I try to remember the circumstances completely around that. Did you roll a nat one, or you just rolled poorly? Do you remember?
There is a whole series of bad rolls, I think, following it, and then like the roof collapsed and we all died, and
yeah,
it was the worst possible things in a sequence happen.
Yeah,
they all
lots of
failed.
failures. Yes,
which we didn't even touch on, failures and critical hits.
Yeah, so we should talk about that really quick. So, if you let's do this in relation to attacks first. So if you roll a 1, that is considered a natural fail. That means your attack's just going to fail. It doesn't matter about your modifier. You can't add your modifier and get above that 1. You roll a 1, it's a 1. Sorry, my bad. You're going to miss. potentially, and Phil has done this in some instances where if you nat fail an attack, you may lose your weapon. You may drop it, it may break, it may explode into a gajillion pieces.
You don't have to do things like that. I mean, there are even instances where the book kind of mentions that you can still have a critical failure. You could still roll a 1 and succeed on a task, but have all of these terrible consequences on the back of it.
Sure. Yeah.
I never go that route. If you rolled a 1, you failed, no matter what. That's just how I operate. But likewise, yeah, like, okay, roll again. And if you roll another one, like, sorry about that magical weapon you had, but it's toast.
I think of Matt's katana immediately because I feel like you tried to get that thing out of the game a couple times.
That weapon should not have been given to him.
But on the flip side of all that, if you roll a natural 20, that is a critical hit. And so you get to roll double damage on an attack with it.
Oh, yeah, it's huge.
Correct.
And so that really packs a punch when you roll it. That's when everybody stands up and cheers and like, yeah.
Totally. And I think we've run into instances before where we've had to look this up where you technically, so you would hit with the natural 20 and then you would roll your damage twice. That's the official rule is you would roll damage and then you would roll damage again. We instituted a house roll where you roll your damage and it just doubles your damage because it would suck really bad if you roll a 15 on your damage and then roll a 1 on your bonus damage and then so you only did 16 damage. That's no fun. It's a lot more fun to do 30 damage. So we kind of did that way. I think that was a good rule by us, and it does help you a little bit. It takes one more dice roll out of the game, so it keeps things moving a little quicker if you just have to multiply.
And as the DM, if you roll like a 2 and you just double that, I'm okay with that too. So.
Right. If you do it behind a screen, you could have rolled a 15.
No, we've discussed this in the mailbag.
The
Players
fudge.
don't get a fudge
Mailbag.
dice rolls.
So one thing to note on the natural failures and natural successes. I say success because when you're outside of combat and you do a skill check and you roll a nat 20 in a skill check is not an instant success. The reason for that is, like we talked about earlier, if you have a challenge rating of something that's a 32 and you roll a 20 and your modifier's a 5, you have a 25 and the challenge rating for whatever you were doing was a 30. You did not succeed at doing that thing.
If you're trying to seduce a devil or a dragon. That's going to be a really hard challenge rating.
Yes.
Keep it in your pants, Bard.
Go to the extremes when you think about
Yes.
is it going to work or not? Probably not, even though you rolled a 20.
Right. Use your best judgment. If it's something that they probably shouldn't do, set that CR rating pretty high. That way, if they roll the nat 20 and they're like, yeah, I did it, and you can be like, no, you didn't. Good try, but no. And one more thing that we need to back up and talk about really quick. We talked about it a little bit with inspiration. So if you're granted inspiration, you get to use that at any time to give yourself advantage on a roll. Now, this advantage and disadvantage can pop up in other places, but let's talk about it really quick what advantage and disadvantage means.
So advantage means you get to roll twice. Well, okay, both of these mean you get to roll twice. But with advantage, you get to take the higher number of your two rolls. Disadvantage is the opposite. You roll 2 dice and you take the lower of those 2 numbers.
And Phil, what instances may you roll for advantage or disadvantage depending on what?
Oh man, honestly, it can happen.
There's a lot.
No,
Yeah,
put
it
you
can
on the
happen a
spot.
lot.
It's fine.
The first one that comes to mind, like, is this is very combat heavy. We didn't talk about this another episode, but is flanking. If a creature's flanked, you get a roll with advantage. There are a lot of combat tactics that allow you to roll your attacks with advantage. That's a big one. There are situational things that could grant you advantage. So maybe you can see the opposing party and they can't see you. So typically, like in a first round of combat, you may have advantage on that particular group because you know where they're at and they have no idea where you're at. So you're kind of swooping in there for advantage attacks.
Somebody's down on the ground and prone. You
Yep.
get advantage on it.
You
Certain
slip and fall, disadvantage, right? Like,
Yep.
Right. So that's talking about combat specific ones. I think the nice thing about advantage and disadvantage is outside of combat, you can kind of reward and punish people in a way. And I don't want to say punish because that's kind of the wrong word in this instance, but you can do those based on situations. So like if somebody's trying to persuade somebody and they give a really good argument at the table, you can grant them advantage based on the argument they gave.
That is
I would
true.
reward players for
Yeah.
doing that.
I do
Roll
try
with
to do
advantage.
that.
That was a good argument. Yeah, sure. He doesn't have anything to say against that. Or maybe you fumbled and did something really weird, and it's like, disadvantage on that.
I also like to give it too for players that really cleverly use their items.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like even the random items that you get just in your like starter equipment. Like if you can come up with a good use for
Those
those.
1,000 ball bearings.
Oh, I love those 1,000 ball bearings.
But it also could be something with your character or your backstory.
Mhm.
So it's like if you were trying to do a religion check on something and the cleric is doing the check,
Mhm.
they might get advantage just because they're a cleric and so they're going to have
Right.
experience knowing that type of field.
Absolutely.
Or like a paladin wearing plate armor is going to have disadvantage on stealth checks. He can't sneak around in plate armor. He clinks and clanks everywhere he goes, so he would roll disadvantage on that.
True.
Any other thoughts on any of this? This was a really good episode, guys.
There's a lot. It's not always going to pop up. So sometimes it's just going to be just get started and you'll run into weird situations and you're going to have to probably look some things up, and that's okay.
And don't be afraid to just make it up on the spot and look it up later. And if you're wrong, own it. Apologize if you feel like you need to. And I mean, it's your game at the end of the day. So
That's right. I love that. It's going to be great. It's going to be fun.
I mean, even if you kill your players, they can make new characters. So
That's exactly right. That's going to do it for this episode of Bards and Barrels. You can listen to past episodes of the show anywhere podcasts can be found. Want to stay in the loop and not missing the latest from us? Be sure to head over and give us a like and follow on Facebook and Instagram at Bards and Barrels. We'll see you soon.